The moment I switched our dinner plates and watched my stepmother's face drain of color, I knew my suspicions about her wanting me dead were absolutely correct. What I didn't expect was that she would confess everything right there at the family table, revealing a web of lies, insurance fraud, and calculated murder that would destroy our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Chen, and 3 months ago, I was a naive 24-year-old graduate student who believed that family meant safety, love meant protection, and stepmothers could genuinely care for their deceased husband's children. I was completing my master's degree in forensic chemistry at Northwestern University, living at home in our suburban Chicago residence to save money while finishing my thesis on toxicological analysis methods. The irony of my academic specialization would soon become the very thing that saved my life. Our house in Winnetka represented everything my father had worked decades to achieve. The colonial-style mansion sat on 2 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds, with a circular driveway that curved past fountains and seasonal flower displays that required a full-time gardening service to maintain. Inside, hardwood floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and original artwork adorned walls that separated rooms large enough to host formal entertaining. My father, David Chen, had built his wealth through a successful pharmaceutical distribution company that supplied medical facilities throughout the Midwest. His business acumen and relentless work ethic had transformed a small family operation into a regional empire worth millions of dollars. But success had come at the cost of personal relationships, leaving him emotionally distant and professionally obsessed until my mother's death from cancer 2 years earlier. The loss had devastated him in ways that revealed vulnerabilities I had never witnessed during my childhood. The confident businessman who commanded respect in boardrooms became a grief-stricken widower who struggled with basic daily routines. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket, making him susceptible to emotional manipulation from anyone who offered comfort and companionship. Victoria Blackwood entered our lives 8 months after my mother's funeral, presenting herself as a grief counselor who specialized in helping families navigate loss and transition. She was 42 years old, strikingly beautiful, and possessed an intuitive understanding of exactly what my father needed to hear during his darkest emotional period. Her credentials appeared legitimate, her references checked out, and her compassionate demeanor convinced everyone that her intentions were purely professional. Within 3 months, their relationship had evolved from therapeutic to romantic. Within 6 months, they were engaged. The wedding took place exactly 1 year after my mother's death, in a small ceremony that Victoria insisted should be private and dignified rather than elaborate and celebratory. I had reservations about the timing and circumstances, but grief affects people differently, and I wanted my father to find happiness again. Victoria seemed genuinely devoted to his well-being, took interest in his business affairs, and made efforts to include me in their new family dynamic. She encouraged family dinners, planned holiday celebrations, and appeared committed to honoring my mother's memory while building new traditions. But subtle changes began occurring that created undercurrents of unease I could not initially articulate or justify. My father's health started declining in ways that seemed inconsistent with his age and previous medical history. He developed chronic fatigue that his physicians attributed to stress and depression. His appetite decreased, leading to significant weight loss that concerned his doctors but never resulted in definitive diagnoses. Cognitive issues emerged gradually, affecting his memory and decision-making abilities in ways that impacted his business performance. Victoria responded to these health concerns with apparent devotion and care. She accompanied him to medical appointments, managed his medications, and hired private nurses for home care when symptoms became more severe. Her attentiveness appeared exemplary, and medical professionals praised her dedication to supporting his treatment and recovery. However, my background in chemistry created awareness of symptom patterns that might not be obvious to healthcare providers who lacked toxicological training. The combination of gastrointestinal distress, neurological symptoms, and gradual cognitive decline suggested potential poisoning scenarios that could be difficult to detect without specific testing protocols. These suspicions remained theoretical until I began noticing Victoria's behavior during family meals. She consistently served my father's food personally, often preparing his plate in the kitchen before bringing it to the dining room. She showed unusual interest in ensuring he consumed everything she provided, frequently encouraging him to finish his portions despite his reduced appetite. More concerning was her apparent monitoring of my own eating habits. She would watch intently as I consumed meals she had prepared, asking detailed questions about taste, texture, and my satisfaction with various dishes. Initially, I interpreted this attention as normal stepmother behavior aimed at building our relationship through shared meal experiences. But the scrutiny felt increasingly invasive and purposeful rather than nurturing. 3 weeks ago, I decided to conduct an informal experiment that would either validate or eliminate my growing suspicions. Using knowledge gained through my forensic chemistry studies, I began paying careful attention to the preparation, presentation, and consumption of family meals. I documented timing, ingredients, cooking methods, and serving procedures in a private journal that I kept hidden in my bedroom. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and disturbing. Victoria consistently prepared separate portions for family members, using different serving dishes and utensils for each person's meal. She maintained strict control over food preparation and would become agitated if anyone attempted to assist with cooking or serving responsibilities. Most significantly, she showed intense interest in ensuring that each person consumed their specifically designated portions. During one dinner last week, I noticed that my father's water glass appeared slightly cloudy compared to everyone else's beverages. When I casually suggested switching glasses to taste his mineral water selection, Victoria immediately intervened, insisting that his water contained specialized electrolyte supplements prescribed by his physician for his ongoing health issues. The explanation was plausible, but her defensive reaction seemed disproportionate to my innocent request. That incident crystallized my determination to investigate further, despite the potential consequences of discovering that my suspicions were correct. If Victoria was systematically poisoning my father, his deteriorating health would continue until the damage became irreversible or fatal. If she was also targeting me, my own life was at risk, and my forensic chemistry knowledge might be the only thing preventing my successful murder. The psychological pressure of living with these suspicions while maintaining normal family interactions was becoming unbearable. Every meal felt like a potential crime scene. Every conversation with Victoria required careful analysis of her words and motivations. Every moment of my father's declining health carried the weight of my potential knowledge about its true cause. I needed definitive proof that would either confirm my fears or restore my peace of mind. 2 days ago, I made the decision to secretly collect food samples from our family dinners for laboratory analysis. Using small containers hidden in my purse, I began discreetly preserving portions of meals that Victoria prepared specifically for my father and myself. These samples would be tested at the university laboratory where I conducted my thesis research, using equipment capable of detecting a wide range of toxic substances. The plan was risky because discovery would likely prompt Victoria to modify her methods or accelerate her timeline if my suspicions were accurate. But the alternative was allowing potential murders to continue while I remained paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Yesterday evening, I submitted the collected samples for comprehensive toxicological screening. The results would be available within 48 hours, providing scientific evidence of either intentional poisoning or innocent food preparation. Those results would determine my next course of action and potentially save both my father's life and my own. But I did not anticipate that tonight's family dinner would force my hand before laboratory confirmation became available. The dining room was set with our finest china and crystal stemware, creating an atmosphere of formal elegance that Victoria preferred for family meals. Candles flickered in silver candlesticks, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany table that had been my mother's pride and joy. The scene appeared peaceful and refined, exactly the type of family gathering that represented stability and love. My father sat at the head of the table, his appearance noticeably more frail than even a month earlier. His clothing hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his complexion carried a grayish pallor that suggested ongoing illness. Despite his condition, he maintained his courteous demeanor and expressed appreciation for Victoria's efforts to create special family moments. Victoria moved gracefully between the kitchen and dining room, presenting each course with practiced efficiency and obvious pride in her culinary skills. Her behavior appeared completely normal, showing no signs of nervousness or guilt that might indicate awareness of my growing suspicions about her intentions. As she placed my dinner plate before me, I noticed that the presentation was particularly elaborate. The main course had been garnished with herbs and sauces arranged in decorative patterns that suggested special attention to visual appeal. The aroma was enticing, and the portion size was generous compared to my usual servings, but something about the careful presentation triggered my analytical instincts. Looking across the table at my father's plate, I observed that his meal appeared identical in preparation and presentation. Victoria had clearly invested significant effort in creating this particular dinner, taking extra time with seasoning, garnishing, and plating that exceeded her normal attention to detail. The special nature of tonight's meal, combined with my pending laboratory results and mounting suspicions, created a moment of perfect clarity about the danger we might be facing. I made a decision that would either expose a murderer or reveal my own paranoid delusions. When Victoria excused herself to retrieve the wine selection from the kitchen, I quickly and quietly switched my dinner plate with my father's identical serving. The exchange took less than 10 seconds and appeared seamless to any casual observer. When Victoria returned with the wine bottles, I watched her face carefully as she resumed her seat and began eating her own meal. Her expression remained pleasant and conversational as she encouraged us to enjoy our dinner and share details about our respective days. But when she glanced at my father's plate and then at mine, I detected a momentary flicker of confusion that crossed her features before she quickly recovered her composure. "How is everything tasting tonight?" she asked, her voice maintaining its usual warm tone while her eyes seemed to be calculating something I could not yet understand. "Delicious as always," my father replied, though he was eating slowly and seemed to lack his usual appetite. I took a careful bite of what had originally been my father's portion, paying attention to any unusual flavors or textures that might indicate tampering. The food tasted normal, but my forensic training had taught me that many toxic substances could be virtually undetectable when properly administered. 20 minutes later, as we finished the main course and Victoria prepared to serve dessert, I noticed that she was watching me with unusual intensity. Her casual conversation continued, but her attention seemed focused on my physical condition and behavior rather than our family discussion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I heard her quietly asking my father how he was feeling and whether he had experienced any unusual symptoms during dinner. That question confirmed my worst fears and validated every suspicion I had developed over the past several weeks. Victoria was indeed poisoning our food, and tonight's dinner had been intended to be particularly lethal. But by switching plates, I had potentially saved my father's life while putting my own in immediate danger. When I returned to the dining room, Victoria was clearing plates and preparing coffee service. Her movements seemed more hurried than usual, and she appeared to be making mental calculations about timing and dosage that I could only guess. As she placed the coffee cups on the table, I realized that the evening was far from over, and that my discovered deception would soon become apparent to someone who had been planning our murders with meticulous precision. The next 30 minutes would determine whether my forensic chemistry knowledge and quick thinking had been sufficient to survive a stepmother who had been systematically destroying our family from within. The Northwestern University Chemistry Laboratory became my sanctuary during the darkest period of family uncertainty I had ever experienced. While my classmates conducted routine experiments for academic credit, I was secretly analyzing food samples that could provide evidence of attempted murder within my own household. The sterile environment, precise equipment, and methodical procedures offered psychological refuge from the emotional chaos that had consumed my home life. My thesis research on advanced toxicological detection methods had equipped me with sophisticated analytical capabilities that extended far beyond typical graduate student training. Professor Margaret Steinberg, my faculty advisor, had recognized exceptional potential in my work and provided access to cutting-edge instrumentation typically reserved for professional forensic laboratories. This privileged access would prove instrumental in uncovering the truth about Victoria's intentions. The laboratory's schedule required strategic planning to conduct my personal investigation without arousing suspicion from academic colleagues or faculty supervisors. Official research hours were monitored and documented, creating potential complications if anyone questioned my unusual testing procedures or sample origins. I needed to maintain absolute discretion while utilizing university resources for purposes that extended beyond academic requirements. Late evening sessions provided optimal conditions for conducting unauthorized analysis. The chemistry building remained accessible to graduate students with appropriate security clearance, but most researchers departed by 7 o'clock, leaving the laboratories essentially empty during overnight hours. This solitude allowed me to process my collected samples without explaining their origins or justifying my testing protocols to curious observers. The first challenge involved developing detection methods for substances that Victoria might be using to poison family meals. Traditional toxicology screening focused on common drugs, alcohol, and industrial chemicals, but deliberate poisoning scenarios often involved more exotic compounds that required specialized analytical approaches. My academic training provided theoretical knowledge of various toxic substances, but practical detection required extensive research and experimental development. Arsenic emerged as a primary candidate based on the symptoms my father had been experiencing over the past several months. Chronic arsenic exposure produces gastrointestinal distress, neurological impairment, and progressive weakness that closely matched his declining health condition. The substance could be administered gradually in small doses, creating cumulative toxicity that might be attributed to natural illness progression, rather than intentional poisoning. Advanced spectroscopic analysis revealed trace amounts of arsenic in food samples collected from my father's dinner portions over the previous week. The concentrations were significant enough to cause health deterioration, but remained below levels that would trigger immediate acute poisoning symptoms. This dosing strategy demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of toxicological principles that suggested careful planning rather than impulsive action. The discovery validated my worst suspicions while creating profound emotional distress about the implications for our family situation. Victoria had been systematically poisoning my father with enough subtlety to avoid medical detection, while gradually destroying his health and cognitive function. The methodical nature of her approach indicated long-term planning aimed at creating apparent natural death rather than obvious murder. But arsenic was not the only toxic substance present in the analyzed samples. Further testing revealed traces of digitalis, a cardiac glycoside derived from foxglove plants that affects heart rhythm and blood pressure regulation. When administered in controlled doses, digitalis could create cardiac irregularities that might be attributed to age-related health decline or stress-induced medical conditions. Combined with arsenic, the two substances created a synergistic toxic effect that accelerated physical deterioration while maintaining plausible medical explanations. The sophistication of this dual compound poisoning strategy demonstrated extensive knowledge of pharmacology and toxicology that exceeded typical amateur capabilities. Victoria had either conducted extensive research on murder methods or possessed professional training in chemistry, medicine, or related fields that she had concealed from our family. This realization prompted investigation into Victoria's background and credentials that revealed disturbing discrepancies between her claimed qualifications and verifiable professional history. The grief counseling certification she had presented to my father appeared legitimate on surface examination, but deeper research revealed gaps in her educational background and employment history that suggested fabricated identity elements. Professional licensing databases contained no records of Victoria Blackwood maintaining active counseling credentials in Illinois or any neighboring states. The university she claimed to have attended for graduate psychology training had no alumna records matching her name or graduation year. The therapeutic practice she allegedly operated before meeting my father had no business registration or professional insurance documentation. These discoveries indicated that Victoria had constructed an entirely false professional identity specifically designed to target vulnerable widowers like my father. Her apparent expertise in grief counseling was likely based on research and practice rather than formal training, allowing her to manipulate emotional vulnerabilities with calculated precision. The evidence suggested that she was a professional predator who specialized in identifying wealthy men recovering from spousal loss, establishing romantic relationships through fabricated credentials, and subsequently eliminating them for financial gain. My father represented not just a romantic conquest, but a financial target whose death would provide substantial inheritance benefits. Further analysis of the food samples revealed that my own dinner portions had been contaminated with different substances than those administered to my father. While his meals contained arsenic and digitalis combinations designed for gradual elimination, my food had been treated with acute toxins that would cause rapid onset symptoms requiring immediate medical intervention. The specific compounds detected in my samples included ricin, a protein toxin derived from castor beans that causes severe gastrointestinal and respiratory symptoms within hours of consumption. Unlike the gradual poisons administered to my father, ricin was designed to create medical emergencies that would appear to be sudden illness rather than chronic health decline. This differential poisoning strategy revealed Victoria's sophisticated planning for eliminating both family members while creating different apparent cause of death scenarios. My father's gradual decline would suggest natural illness progression, while my sudden acute symptoms would appear to be medical emergency or allergic reaction. The varied approaches would prevent investigators from recognizing patterns that might indicate intentional poisoning. The realization that I had been consuming potentially lethal substances during recent family meals created immediate concern about my own health status and survival prospects. Emergency medical consultation revealed elevated liver enzymes and other biomarkers consistent with recent toxin exposure, confirming that Victoria's poisoning attempts had been causing measurable physiological damage. Fortunately, my forensic chemistry background had created awareness that prompted early detection before permanent organ damage occurred. Immediate chelation therapy and supportive medical treatment could reverse most effects of recent poison exposure, but continued consumption would likely result in irreversible health consequences or death. This medical consultation provided additional scientific evidence of intentional poisoning while establishing documentation that could support future legal proceedings against Victoria. Blood tests, urine analysis, and tissue samples created an objective record of toxin exposure that would be difficult to dispute or explain through alternative theories. Armed with comprehensive laboratory evidence, medical documentation, and background research findings, I possessed sufficient proof to expose Victoria's murderous intentions and protect both my father and myself from further poisoning attempts. However, presenting this evidence required careful consideration of legal procedures, family dynamics, and personal safety concerns. Direct confrontation with Victoria could prompt her to accelerate her timeline, modify her methods, or attempt to eliminate evidence before authorities could intervene. Alternative approaches included contacting law enforcement, consulting with attorneys, or seeking protective intervention through adult protective services for my father's welfare. But the plate-switching incident during last night's dinner had already initiated a dangerous game of deception that required immediate resolution. Victoria would soon realize that her poisoning attempt had failed, potentially prompting desperate measures to complete her plan before discovery became inevitable. The scientific evidence I had gathered would prove invaluable for legal proceedings, but immediate survival required different strategies that prioritized safety over justice. Victoria's demonstrated willingness to commit murder, combined with her sophisticated knowledge of toxic substances, created immediate threats that demanded tactical response rather than academic analysis. My transformation from naive graduate student to forensic detective had provided essential knowledge and evidence, but the next phase would require courage, strategic thinking, and potentially dangerous confrontation with someone who had already proven capable of calculated murder. The laboratory analysis had revealed the truth about Victoria's intentions, but exposing that truth would require surviving her reaction to discovery. Tonight's family dinner would likely determine whether my scientific investigation had been sufficient to save our lives or merely provided posthumous evidence of our murders. The contrast between my academic environment and family situation created psychological tension that challenged every assumption about safety, trust, and institutional protection. The university laboratory represented rational inquiry and methodical problem-solving, while our family home had become a crime scene where scientific knowledge served as the only defense against sophisticated murder attempts. This duality forced rapid maturation that transformed my identity from sheltered student to independent adult, capable of protecting myself and others through applied intelligence and strategic action. The forensic chemistry skills I had developed for academic purposes became survival tools that could determine life or death outcomes in real-world scenarios. The evidence was overwhelming, the danger was immediate, and the time for passive observation had expired. Tonight's dinner would test whether academic knowledge could translate into practical survival, when confronted with a stepmother whose grief counseling facade concealed the calculated mind of a serial killer. The revelation that Victoria had been administering different poison combinations to my father and myself demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that demanded comprehensive investigation beyond simple toxicological analysis. Her methodical approach suggested extensive planning, professional knowledge, and likely previous experience with similar schemes. Understanding the full scope of her operation became essential for protecting ourselves and potentially preventing future victims. My forensic chemistry training had taught me that successful investigations required examining patterns across multiple data points, rather than focusing on isolated incidents. Criminal behavior typically follows predictable patterns that become visible when sufficient evidence is analyzed systematically. Victoria's poisoning strategy represented just one component of what appeared to be a comprehensive fraud scheme designed to eliminate wealthy targets while avoiding detection. The process of reconstructing her systematic deception began with financial analysis of changes that had occurred in our household since her marriage to my father. Bank statements, insurance policies, legal documents, and business records provided a documentary trail that revealed the true scope of her infiltration into our family's economic foundation. These financial patterns would prove even more revealing than the toxicological evidence. Within 3 months of their marriage, Victoria had convinced my father to restructure his estate planning in ways that significantly benefited her financial position. The modifications appeared reasonable on surface examination, reflecting natural adjustments that occur when widowed individuals remarry and seek to provide for new spouses. However, detailed analysis revealed strategic changes that maximized her inheritance while minimizing protections for existing family members. The original estate plan had designated me as primary beneficiary of my father's pharmaceutical distribution business, with substantial trust fund provisions that would ensure financial security throughout my lifetime. These arrangements reflected my mother's insistence that family wealth should support their children's future opportunities rather than being dissipated through subsequent marriages or business decisions. Victoria's influence had systematically eroded these protections through incremental modifications that appeared individually reasonable but collectively transferred the majority of family assets to her control. New life insurance policies named her as sole beneficiary, while existing policies that protected my inheritance were allowed to lapse through administrative oversight. Business ownership structures were modified to provide her with operational authority and succession rights that superseded family member claims. Most significantly, a new will had been executed that designated Victoria as primary heir with broad discretionary authority over asset distribution. While this document included provisions for my education and basic support, the specific terms were sufficiently vague to allow complete disinheritance if she chose to interpret them restrictively. These financial modifications had been accomplished through a combination of emotional manipulation and professional expertise that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of estate planning strategies. Victoria had convinced my father that these changes represented prudent financial management and spousal protection, while actually constructing a framework that would eliminate his biological family from any meaningful inheritance. The timeline of these financial changes correlated precisely with the onset of my father's health decline, suggesting that the poisoning strategy had been implemented simultaneously with the estate restructuring. As his cognitive function deteriorated due to chronic toxin exposure, his ability to evaluate financial decisions diminished correspondingly, making him increasingly vulnerable to manipulation and poor judgment. This correlation between financial exploitation and physical incapacitation revealed the comprehensive nature of Victoria's scheme. She was not simply attempting to inherit family wealth through natural spousal succession, but was actively accelerating my father's death while positioning herself to benefit maximally from his demise. Further investigation into her background revealed a pattern of similar relationships with other wealthy widowed men over the past decade. Public records searches identified 3 previous marriages to affluent individuals who had died within 2 years of their weddings to Victoria. Each of these deaths had been attributed to natural causes or medical complications. But the pattern suggested a systematic approach to targeting and eliminating vulnerable wealthy men. The first documented case involved Robert Hamilton, a retired investment banker from Minneapolis who had lost his wife to breast cancer. Victoria had met him through a grief support group, where she volunteered as a facilitator. Their relationship progressed rapidly from therapeutic support to romantic involvement, culminating in marriage 8 months after their initial meeting. Robert died 14 months later from apparent heart failure, leaving Victoria as sole heir to his $3 million estate. The second case involved Dr. James Morrison, a recently widowed cardiologist from St. Louis whose wife had died in an automobile accident. Victoria had contacted him initially as a grief counselor specializing in sudden loss trauma. Their professional relationship evolved into personal involvement, resulting in marriage within 6 months. Dr. Morrison died 18 months later from complications related to what appeared to be food poisoning that progressed to multiple organ failure. Victoria inherited his medical practice, real estate holdings, and investment portfolio valued at approximately $4 million. The third case involved Thomas Blackwood, a manufacturing executive from Detroit, whose wife had died from complications following routine surgery. Victoria had approached him through professional networking events related to business leadership during difficult transitions. Their relationship developed over the course of a year before marriage, making this case appear more natural than the previous rapid progressions. Thomas died 22 months after their wedding, from what medical examiners determined to be complications from pre-existing cardiac conditions. Victoria's inheritance from this marriage exceeded $6 million and included valuable manufacturing patents and international business interests. These documented cases revealed several consistent patterns that matched Victoria's current relationship with my father. Each target was a recently widowed professional man with substantial assets and limited family connections that might interfere with inheritance succession. Each relationship began through Victoria's initiative in context related to grief counseling or professional support services. Each progression from initial contact to marriage occurred within a time frame that suggested calculated relationship development rather than organic romantic evolution. Most significantly, each death occurred within 2 years of marriage and was attributed to medical conditions that could plausibly result from natural health decline in middle-aged men experiencing stress and grief. The variety of apparent causes prevented medical authorities from recognizing patterns that might indicate serial murder, while the timing ensured that Victoria gained maximum financial benefit from each relationship. The combined inheritance from these 3 previous marriages totaled approximately $13 million, suggesting that Victoria's operations represented a systematic criminal enterprise rather than opportunistic individual crimes. Her selection of targets, relationship development strategies, and execution methods demonstrated professional-level planning and risk management that had enabled her to avoid criminal prosecution while accumulating substantial wealth. This pattern analysis revealed that my father and I represented her 4th targeted family, with projected inheritance values that would likely exceed $15 million when combined with his business assets, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios. The stakes involved in our situation were sufficient to justify extreme measures to eliminate any obstacles to her successful completion of this criminal operation. Understanding the systematic nature of Victoria's crimes provided crucial insight into her likely responses to discovery or interference with her plans. Previous successful operations had trained her to anticipate potential complications and develop contingency strategies for maintaining control over targeted situations. Her willingness to commit murder was not impulsive emotional reaction but calculated business decision based on financial analysis of costs versus benefits. This recognition fundamentally changed my assessment of the danger we faced and the strategies required for survival. Victoria was not a desperate individual making poor decisions under pressure, but a professional criminal executing a proven system that had generated millions of dollars through previous successful operations. Her expertise in manipulation, deception, and murder created threats that required equally sophisticated defensive responses. The evidence I had compiled through toxicological analysis, financial investigation, and background research provided comprehensive documentation of Victoria's criminal enterprise. However, presenting this information to law enforcement authorities would require careful consideration of evidence preservation, witness protection, and prosecution strategies that could ensure successful conviction while preventing her escape or retaliation. More immediately, my growing knowledge of her systematic approach created urgent concerns about accelerated timelines or modified tactics that might result from her recognition that her current operation was being investigated. Professional criminals typically developed contingency plans for situations where their activities faced exposure, and these plans often involved eliminating evidence sources through whatever means necessary. The plate-switching incident during the previous evening's dinner had likely alerted Victoria that her poisoning attempts were being detected or anticipated. Her reaction to this development would depend on her assessment of how much I knew about her overall operation and whether she considered me a manageable threat or an existential danger to her continued freedom and success. My forensic chemistry background had enabled me to detect and document her poisoning strategy, but my investigation into her systematic criminal enterprise had revealed threats that extended far beyond simple domestic murder attempts. Victoria's demonstrated capability for long-term planning, financial manipulation, and serial killing created a level of danger that required immediate professional intervention rather than continued individual investigation. The transformation from suspicious stepdaughter to forensic investigator had provided essential knowledge about the scope and nature of the criminal operation targeting our family. However, this knowledge also created responsibility for preventing not only our own murders, but potentially future crimes against other vulnerable families, who might become Victoria's subsequent targets. The evidence was comprehensive, the pattern was clear, and the immediate danger was escalating. The question that remained was whether my systematic analysis had been completed in time to save our lives and bring a serial killer to justice before she could complete her current operation or begin targeting her next victims. Tonight's confrontation would determine whether pattern recognition and systematic investigation could triumph over professional criminal expertise backed by millions of dollars in previous successful operations. The discovery of Victoria's serial killing pattern transformed my investigation from personal survival effort into comprehensive criminal justice documentation. Understanding that she represented an active threat to future victims created moral obligation to compile evidence that would ensure successful prosecution and prevent additional murders. The systematic nature of her crimes demanded equally systematic evidence collection that would withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys, forensic experts, and judicial review. My apartment underwent complete transformation into a professional investigation headquarters that rivaled any police detective's work environment. Every available surface became dedicated to organizing, cataloging, and cross-referencing the overwhelming volume of evidence I had accumulated through weeks of intensive research. Financial documents covered the dining room table in chronological arrangements that traced Victoria's economic infiltration of our family assets. Toxicological reports occupied the kitchen counter alongside detailed charts correlating poison dosages with my father's symptom progression. Background investigation materials filled the living room, creating comprehensive profiles of her previous victims and their circumstances. The scale of documentation required implementing professional evidence management systems to ensure nothing would be overlooked or compromised during eventual legal proceedings. Each piece of evidence received unique identification numbers, detailed provenance documentation, and multiple backup copies stored in separate secure locations. Chain of custody protocols protected the integrity of physical samples and laboratory results. Digital evidence underwent forensic preservation using techniques that would satisfy court admissibility requirements. This meticulous approach reflected understanding that Victoria's sophisticated criminal operation would likely employ equally sophisticated legal defense strategies. Her accumulated wealth from previous murders would finance expert attorneys capable of challenging any evidence that failed to meet professional investigative standards. Successfully prosecuting a serial killer with her resources and experience required anticipating every possible defense argument and neutralizing them through comprehensive preparation. The financial investigation expanded beyond simple documentation of estate planning changes to include comprehensive forensic accounting that revealed the complex money laundering operations Victoria had implemented to conceal her criminal proceeds. Bank records from multiple institutions showed systematic patterns of asset transfers, investment strategies, and tax avoidance schemes that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of financial regulation and enforcement limitations. Her approach to managing inherited wealth revealed professional-level expertise in offshore banking, corporate structure manipulation, and regulatory arbitrage that exceeded capabilities of typical domestic criminals. Shell companies incorporated in Delaware provided layers of ownership obscurity that complicated asset tracing efforts. International wire transfers through jurisdictions with strict banking privacy laws created additional barriers to financial investigation. Trust structures and estate planning vehicles provided legal mechanisms for tax avoidance while maintaining effective control over inherited assets. These financial sophistication indicators suggested that Victoria possessed formal training in accounting, finance, or law that she had concealed, along with her fabricated grief counseling credentials. Her ability to navigate complex regulatory environments while avoiding detection by banking authorities, tax agencies, and law enforcement organizations demonstrated expertise that required years of professional development or extensive criminal education. Investigation into her true identity revealed that Victoria Blackwood represented an entirely constructed persona created specifically for targeting wealthy, widowed men. No legitimate records existed for anyone matching her claimed background, education, or professional history prior to 5 years ago. Social Security Administration databases contained no matching entries for her alleged birth date and place. Educational institutions had no academic records corresponding to her claimed degrees or certifications. Professional licensing authorities had no documentation of her therapeutic practice or continuing education requirements. This complete identity fabrication indicated that Victoria operated as part of a larger criminal organization or had access to sophisticated identity creation services, typically associated with organized crime or international criminal enterprises. Creating convincing false identities required resources, expertise, and connections that exceeded capabilities of individual criminals operating independently. Further investigation revealed that multiple variations of her identity had been used across different geographic regions and time periods. Credit reports, property records, and employment histories showed at least 6 different name combinations and social security numbers associated with similar physical descriptions and financial patterns. This identity proliferation suggested systematic criminal operations that extended beyond the 4 documented murder cases I had initially identified. The scope of her criminal enterprise appeared to involve coordinated targeting of vulnerable, wealthy individuals across multiple states and potentially international locations. Each identity variation provided cover for approaching different victim populations, while maintaining separation between operations that prevented law enforcement agencies from recognizing patterns that might indicate serial criminal activity. Cross-referencing these identity variations with missing persons reports, suspicious death investigations, and inheritance fraud cases revealed additional potential victims whose circumstances matched Victoria's established methods. Preliminary research identified at least 12 cases over the past 8 years that involved mysterious deaths of recently remarried wealthy individuals, where surviving spouses had disappeared shortly after collecting inheritance proceeds. These cases spanned 7 different states and involved accumulated theft estimated at over $40 million, suggesting that Victoria's operation represented one of the most successful serial killing enterprises in modern criminal history. Her ability to avoid detection while systematically murdering victims and stealing their wealth demonstrated criminal sophistication that challenged traditional law enforcement capabilities. The magnitude of these discoveries created overwhelming responsibility for ensuring that comprehensive evidence reached appropriate authorities capable of conducting multi-jurisdictional investigations. Local police departments lacked resources and expertise necessary for pursuing complex financial crimes across state boundaries. Federal agencies possessed requisite capabilities but required substantial evidence documentation to justify allocating resources to investigate cases that had been previously classified as natural deaths or accident circumstances. Documentation of my laboratory findings required creating detailed technical reports that would satisfy expert witness standards in federal court proceedings. Each toxicological analysis needed comprehensive methodology descriptions, equipment calibration records, quality control procedures, and statistical analysis of results. Chain of custody documentation had to account for every sample handling step from initial collection through final analysis and evidence preservation. The medical evidence linking Victoria's poisoning strategy to my father's health decline required consultation with physicians who specialized in toxicology and internal medicine. These medical professionals provided expert opinions correlating observed symptoms with documented poison exposure, while establishing timeline relationships that demonstrated causation rather than coincidental correlation. Psychological profiling of Victoria's behavioral patterns provided additional evidence supporting conclusions about systematic criminal intent, rather than impulsive domestic violence. Her manipulation strategies, relationship development tactics, and victim selection criteria demonstrated consistent methods that indicated professional criminal planning rather than emotional reactions to family conflicts. The combination of toxicological evidence, financial documentation, background investigation, and psychological analysis created a comprehensive case file that established Victoria's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, while providing sufficient detail to support complex federal prosecution efforts. However, the immediate challenge involved presenting this evidence to authorities while ensuring our personal safety during the period between disclosure and arrest. Victoria's demonstrated expertise in criminal operations suggested that she possessed contingency plans for situations where her activities faced exposure. Professional criminals typically developed escape strategies, evidence destruction protocols, and witness elimination procedures for protecting themselves when operations became compromised. Her access to sophisticated poison supplies indicated willingness and capability to accelerate murder timelines if circumstances demanded immediate action. The evidence compilation process had required 3 weeks of intensive work that involved sacrificing sleep, social relationships, and academic responsibilities. Every available moment had been dedicated to research, analysis, and documentation that would ensure Victoria faced appropriate consequences for her crimes, while preventing future victims from suffering similar fates. My transformation from graduate student to criminal investigator had been driven by necessity rather than career ambition, but the experience had revealed analytical capabilities and professional interests that would likely influence my future educational and professional decisions. The satisfaction of uncovering complex criminal operations through systematic investigation suggested that forensic science and criminal justice work aligned well with my intellectual strengths and personal values. However, the immediate priority remained survival rather than career development. The comprehensive evidence I had compiled would prove valuable only if Victoria's reaction to discovery could be managed successfully without resulting in accelerated murder attempts against my father and myself. Tonight's dinner would test whether 3 weeks of intensive investigation had provided sufficient preparation for confronting a professional serial killer whose criminal expertise had enabled 8 years of successful operations worth millions of dollars in stolen wealth. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence alone would not guarantee survival when facing someone whose livelihood depended on eliminating obstacles to her continued criminal success. The stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error was non-existent. Either my systematic investigation and comprehensive evidence compilation would provide sufficient foundation for survival and justice, or Victoria's professional criminal expertise would enable her to complete her 4th successful murder operation while eliminating the primary witness to her systematic crimes. The comprehensive evidence I had assembled created an undeniable foundation for Victoria's prosecution, but the immediate challenge involved translating investigative success into personal survival during the critical period between discovery and law enforcement intervention. Professional criminals possess expertise in crisis management that enables them to eliminate threats when their operations face exposure. Victoria's demonstrated willingness to commit murder, combined with her sophisticated understanding of forensic countermeasures, created immediate danger that required strategic planning beyond simple evidence documentation. The decision to confront Victoria directly represented a calculated risk assessment that weighed certain death through continued poisoning against uncertain outcomes from active resistance. Allowing her systematic murder plan to proceed guaranteed that my father and I would die within weeks or months as her toxin administration reached lethal accumulation levels. Direct confrontation offered possibilities for survival through exposure of her crimes, even though such action would likely prompt desperate countermeasures from someone whose freedom and accumulated wealth depended on maintaining successful criminal operations. Strategic planning for this confrontation required understanding Victoria's psychological profile, operational capabilities, and likely responses to various scenarios that might unfold during our interaction. Criminal psychology literature provided frameworks for predicting behavioral patterns of serial killers when their operations faced discovery. These individuals typically exhibited specific response patterns that could be anticipated and potentially exploited through careful preparation and tactical execution. Victoria's demonstrated preference for subtle, long-term killing methods suggested risk-averse personality characteristics that prioritized avoiding detection over rapid results. This psychological profile indicated that she would likely attempt to maintain her cover identity and continue manipulating circumstances rather than resorting to immediate violence that would attract law enforcement attention. Her investment in establishing relationships and financial structures suggested commitment to preserving her constructed identity rather than abandoning operations at the first sign of complications. However, the systematic nature of her previous successful operations indicated sophisticated contingency planning that would include protocols for managing situations where targets became aware of their danger. Professional criminals develop emergency procedures for eliminating evidence, disposing of witnesses, and implementing escape strategies when circumstances require immediate action. Victoria's access to lethal toxins provided means for accelerating murder timelines if she determined that continued subtle poisoning presented unacceptable risks. The confrontation strategy required creating conditions that would expose her crimes while minimizing opportunities for violent retaliation. Optimal circumstances would involve multiple witnesses, documented evidence of her admissions, and immediate law enforcement response that would prevent escape attempts or evidence destruction. Achieving these conditions demanded careful orchestration of timing, location, and participant management that would constrain her options while maximizing documentation opportunities. Family dinner settings provided natural contexts for initiating confrontation while maintaining psychological pressure that might prompt unguarded responses. Victoria's investment in maintaining domestic normalcy created situations where dramatic behavioral changes would be difficult to explain without revealing criminal motivations. The presence of my father as witness would complicate her ability to deny accusations while potentially motivating protective responses that could expose her true intentions. However, family dinner confrontations also presented significant risks that required mitigation strategies. Victoria's familiarity with our household environment provided advantages in terms of escape routes, weapon access, and evidence disposal opportunities. Her control over food preparation created immediate poisoning risks that could incapacitate resistance before confrontation objectives were achieved. The isolated nature of our residence limited external intervention possibilities if circumstances deteriorated rapidly. Preparation for the confrontation involved implementing multiple contingency measures designed to maximize survival probability, regardless of how Victoria responded to exposure. Hidden recording devices would document any admissions or threats that could support subsequent prosecution efforts. Emergency medical supplies would provide immediate treatment for poison exposure or physical injuries. Secure communication with law enforcement would ensure rapid response if circumstances required immediate intervention. The most critical preparation element involved creating irrefutable evidence of Victoria's criminal intent that could be preserved regardless of confrontation outcomes. Comprehensive documentation packages were prepared for immediate transmission to federal authorities, academic advisors, and legal representatives if emergency circumstances prevented my personal delivery of evidence. These packages included detailed analyses, supporting documentation, and explicit instructions for continuing investigation efforts if I became unable to participate in prosecution proceedings. Financial preparation involved securing access to emergency funds and resources that would enable immediate escape or extended legal proceedings if circumstances required departing our family residence permanently. Victoria's control over household finances created dependency relationships that could be exploited for maintaining control over family members who threatened her operations. Independent financial resources would prevent such manipulation, while ensuring access to professional legal representation and security services. Communication preparation involved establishing secure contact protocols with trusted individuals who could provide assistance or intervention if circumstances required external support. These contacts included university faculty members who were familiar with my research capabilities, medical professionals who could provide emergency treatment for poison exposure, and law enforcement specialists who possessed expertise in complex financial crimes. Each contact received partial information about my investigation to ensure continuity of evidence preservation without creating unnecessary exposure risks. The psychological preparation for confronting a serial killer required developing mental frameworks that would enable clear thinking and tactical decision-making under extreme stress conditions. Training materials from crisis management and hostage negotiation provided techniques for maintaining emotional control while recognizing and responding to escalating threat indicators. Understanding that Victoria possessed extensive experience in manipulation and deception helped prepare for attempts to confuse, intimidate, or redirect attention away from her criminal activities. Physical preparation involved identifying defensive measures and escape routes that could be implemented if confrontation circumstances deteriorated into immediate violence. Victoria's preference for poisoning suggested limited expertise in direct physical violence, but her willingness to commit murder indicated that she would resort to any necessary means to protect her operations. Basic self-defense knowledge and environmental awareness would provide options for survival if circumstances required immediate physical resistance. The timing of confrontation required coordination with external factors that would maximize support availability while minimizing Victoria's preparation opportunities. Weekend schedules provided optimal conditions for extended family interactions without external interruptions that might limit documentation opportunities. However, these same conditions reduced availability of immediate law enforcement response and medical assistance if circumstances required emergency intervention. Evidence revelation strategies required careful sequencing that would build irrefutable cases while preventing Victoria from developing effective counter-responses. Initial accusations needed sufficient specificity to demonstrate serious investigation while withholding detailed knowledge that might enable her to modify her defense approach. Progressive disclosure would maintain psychological pressure while providing opportunities to document her reactions and responses to specific allegations. The confrontation plan incorporated multiple decision points where circumstances could be reassessed and strategies modified based on Victoria's responses to initial challenges. Escalation protocols provided frameworks for increasing pressure if she attempted to deny or deflect accusations, while de-escalation procedures offered options for managing situations where she responded with immediate threats or violence. Documentation during confrontation required balancing evidence collection objectives with personal safety considerations. Recording equipment needed sufficient concealment to avoid detection, while providing clear audio quality that would satisfy legal admissibility requirements. Written notes would supplement recorded evidence while providing backup documentation if technical systems failed or were discovered. The ultimate objective involved obtaining admissions of criminal intent that would support prosecution efforts while creating circumstances that prevented Victoria from completing her murder plans against my father and myself. Success would require maintaining tactical advantages throughout the confrontation while avoiding actions that might provide legal defenses for her subsequent criminal proceedings. Failure scenarios required contingency planning that would preserve evidence and protect potential witnesses, even if the immediate confrontation resulted in negative outcomes. Emergency protocols would ensure that comprehensive documentation reached appropriate authorities regardless of what happened to individual participants during the confrontation process. The transformation from evidence compilation to active confrontation represented the most dangerous phase of my investigation, but continued passive observation guaranteed successful completion of Victoria's murder operation. The systematic approach I had developed through weeks of intensive research provided the foundation for strategic thinking that would be essential for survival during the critical hours ahead. Tonight's dinner would determine whether comprehensive preparation and strategic planning could triumph over the criminal expertise of someone whose systematic murder operations had succeeded without detection for 8 years. The stakes involved not only our immediate survival but potentially preventing Victoria from claiming additional victims through future operations if she managed to escape justice once again. The evening of confrontation arrived with deceptive normalcy that masked the extraordinary circumstances about to unfold within our family dining room. Victoria maintained her established routine of elaborate dinner preparation, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that provided perfect cover for the systematic poisoning operation I was about to expose. Her calm demeanor and practiced hospitality demonstrated the psychological control that had enabled her to execute similar operations against previous victims without arousing suspicion until their deaths eliminated any possibility of resistance. The formal table setting reflected Victoria's preference for creating memorable family moments that would later serve as evidence of her devoted stepmother persona during any subsequent investigations. Fine china, crystal stemware, and carefully arranged floral centerpieces created visual documentation of domestic harmony that contradicted accusations of deliberate murder. Her attention to photographic details suggested understanding that these scenes might eventually require scrutiny from law enforcement professionals or insurance investigators. My father's appearance provided stark evidence of the systematic poisoning effects that had been accumulating over months of regular toxin exposure. His weight loss had become pronounced enough to require clothing alterations, while his complexion carried the grayish pallor characteristic of chronic arsenic poisoning. Cognitive symptoms had progressed to include memory lapses and concentration difficulties that affected his ability to participate meaningfully in business operations or family discussions. Despite these obvious health deterioration indicators, medical professionals had failed to identify poisoning as the underlying cause of his condition. Victoria's careful dosing strategy had created symptom patterns that mimicked natural illness progression in middle-aged men experiencing stress and grief. Her selection of toxins that produced ambiguous clinical presentations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medical diagnostic limitations and forensic detection challenges. The plate-switching strategy I had developed required precise timing and careful observation to execute successfully without alerting Victoria to my tactical intentions. The exchange needed to occur during a natural interruption in her attention, while appearing completely innocent to casual observation. Success would depend on her failure to notice the substitution until toxin effects began manifesting in unexpected victims, creating confusion that might prompt unguarded admissions about her poisoning operation. As Victoria served the main course with her characteristic attention to presentation details, I observed that tonight's meal had received particularly elaborate preparation. The portions were larger than usual, the seasoning appeared more complex, and the garnish arrangements suggested special occasion significance. These preparation indicators aligned with my suspicion that tonight's dinner was intended to deliver lethal toxin doses that would eliminate both my father and myself, while appearing to be coincidental food poisoning or allergic reactions. The sophistication of her presentation skills demonstrated professional-level training in hospitality or event management that she had concealed, along with her other fabricated credentials. Her ability to create convincing domestic scenes while simultaneously orchestrating murder attempts required psychological compartmentalization abilities that indicated either extensive criminal experience or underlying personality disorders that enabled emotional detachment from violent actions. When Victoria excused herself to retrieve wine selections from the kitchen, I implemented the plate exchange with movements practiced through mental rehearsal during the preceding days. The swap required less than 8 seconds and appeared completely natural within the context of adjusting table settings or examining food presentation. Neither my father nor Victoria displayed any indication of noticing the substitution when she returned with the wine service. However, as the meal progressed, I detected subtle changes in Victoria's behavior that suggested growing awareness that something was different about tonight's dinner dynamics. Her conversation maintained its usual pleasant tone, but her attention seemed increasingly focused on monitoring our physical responses to food consumption, rather than engaging in natural family discussion. She asked several questions about how we were feeling and whether we were enjoying the flavors of specific dishes. These monitoring behaviors aligned with patterns described in criminal psychology literature regarding poisoners who derive psychological satisfaction from observing their victims' deterioration. The questions appeared to be genuine concern for our dining experience, but her intense focus on our physical conditions suggested anticipation of specific symptoms that should have been manifesting based on her toxin administration schedule. 25 minutes into the meal, Victoria's demeanor shifted from pleasant attentiveness to barely concealed anxiety, as the expected poisoning effects failed to materialize, according to her predetermined timeline. She began making indirect references to feeling tired or experiencing minor digestive discomfort, comments that seemed designed to prompt similar admissions from my father and myself about developing symptoms. When neither of us reported any unusual physical sensations, Victoria's questioning became more direct and persistent. She asked specifically whether we had noticed any strange tastes in the food, any feelings of nausea or dizziness, or any unusual sensations that might indicate allergic reactions to new ingredients she had incorporated into tonight's recipes. These increasingly desperate inquiries confirmed that the plate-switching strategy had successfully disrupted her poisoning operation, while creating confusion about why her carefully calculated toxin doses were not producing expected results. Her growing agitation suggested that she was beginning to suspect some form of interference with her murder plans, though she had not yet identified the specific nature of the disruption. The psychological pressure of maintaining normal conversation while internally processing the failure of her poisoning attempt created visible stress indicators that contradicted her practiced calm demeanor. Her voice developed slight tension, her hand movements became more precise and controlled, and her eye contact patterns shifted to include frequent glances at our plates and beverages rather than maintaining natural facial engagement during conversation. As we progressed to dessert service, Victoria's behavior became increasingly erratic in ways that suggested internal crisis management regarding the unexpected failure of her systematic murder operation. She offered multiple dessert options with unusual insistence that we try each variety, comments that seemed designed to provide additional opportunities for toxin administration through alternative delivery methods. Her repeated encouragement to consume larger portions and her obvious disappointment when we declined additional servings created an atmosphere of tension that began affecting my father's comfort level. He commented that Victoria seemed unusually anxious about our meal satisfaction and asked whether she was feeling well or experiencing stress about something unrelated to our family dinner. This innocent observation from my father created a critical decision point for Victoria regarding how to manage the growing evidence that her poisoning operation was not proceeding according to plan. She could either maintain her cover persona and attempt to deflect attention from her unusual behavior, or she could escalate her efforts to complete the murder operation through more direct methods that might expose her criminal intentions. Her response revealed the depth of her psychological investment in maintaining successful criminal operations, regardless of complications that might arise during execution. Rather than accepting the failure of tonight's poisoning attempt and developing alternative strategies for future implementation, she became increasingly aggressive in her efforts to ensure that we consumed additional food items that could provide toxin delivery opportunities. The desperation underlying her intensified hospitality efforts created the opening I had been preparing to exploit through my systematic investigation and evidence compilation. Her obvious anxiety about our failure to develop poisoning symptoms provided the psychological pressure necessary to prompt unguarded statements about her true intentions and criminal activities. When I directly questioned her about the unusual ingredients in tonight's meal and her apparent concern about our reactions to specific dishes, Victoria's carefully maintained facade began showing cracks that revealed the calculating criminal mind operating beneath her devoted stepmother persona. Her explanations became increasingly elaborate and defensive, suggesting internal recognition that her cover story was becoming difficult to maintain under direct scrutiny. The moment had arrived to begin implementing the confrontation strategy I had developed through weeks of research and tactical planning. Victoria's psychological state indicated vulnerability to strategic pressure that might prompt admissions about her criminal activities, while her growing desperation suggested that continued passive observation would likely result in escalated murder attempts using more direct methods. The transformation from family dinner to criminal interrogation required maintaining tactical advantages while managing the immediate physical danger posed by someone whose livelihood depended on eliminating obstacles to her continued operations. The evidence I had compiled provided foundation for exposing her crimes, but survival would depend on successfully managing her reaction to discovery during the critical moments when her entire criminal enterprise faced potential exposure. The careful preparation and systematic investigation that had occupied the preceding weeks would now be tested against the criminal expertise of someone whose successful murder operations had generated millions of dollars through 8 years of systematic predation on vulnerable wealthy families. The stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error was non-existent. The deterioration of Victoria's composure created an unprecedented opportunity to transform theoretical evidence into documented admissions that would provide irrefutable proof of her criminal enterprise. Her psychological state had shifted from confident control to defensive anxiety, as the failure of her poisoning operation forced recognition that her systematic murder plan faced unexpected complications. This vulnerability represented the optimal moment to implement systematic interrogation techniques that could extract admissions while maintaining plausible family dinner conversation dynamics. Professional interrogation methodology emphasizes building rapport and trust before introducing challenging questions that might prompt defensive responses. However, the unique circumstances of confronting a serial killer during active murder attempts required modified approaches that prioritized immediate evidence collection over conventional relationship preservation strategies. Victoria's demonstrated expertise in manipulation and deception demanded tactics that prevented her from regaining psychological equilibrium or developing effective counter-strategies. The transition from casual questioning to systematic evidence extraction required maintaining conversational flow while progressively introducing more specific accusations that would force her to either provide convincing explanations or reveal contradictions that exposed her criminal intentions. Each question needed careful formulation to maximize information extraction while preventing her from recognizing the systematic nature of my interrogation approach. My initial approach focused on apparent concern for my father's declining health and curiosity about potential environmental factors that might be contributing to his medical problems. These questions appeared natural within the context of family discussions about healthcare concerns, while creating opportunities to observe Victoria's responses to indirect accusations about deliberate poisoning activities. When I mentioned recent articles about household chemical contamination and their potential health effects, Victoria's reaction provided immediate confirmation that she understood the implications of such inquiries. Her body language became noticeably more rigid, her speech patterns shifted to include longer pauses before responding, and her eye contact patterns changed from natural engagement to calculated assessment of my motivations for raising these particular topics. Her defensive responses to seemingly innocent health-related questions revealed the psychological pressure created by recognition that her criminal activities were being investigated. The careful language she used to deflect attention from environmental factors while emphasizing medical explanations for my father's condition demonstrated sophisticated understanding of potential legal vulnerabilities that could arise from admitting knowledge about toxic exposure scenarios. Building on this initial success, I introduced more specific questions about her background in chemistry and pharmacology that might provide expertise for understanding complex health interactions. These inquiries appeared to seek her professional guidance while actually testing whether she would acknowledge possessing knowledge that could enable sophisticated poisoning operations. Victoria's responses revealed the fundamental contradiction underlying her constructed identity. She needed to maintain credibility as a grief counselor with limited technical knowledge while simultaneously demonstrating sufficient expertise to manage my father's complex medical requirements. This balancing act became increasingly difficult as my questions demanded more specific technical knowledge that exceeded typical counseling education backgrounds. When I asked about her familiarity with drug interactions and potential contraindications between prescription medications and dietary supplements, Victoria provided answers that demonstrated far more pharmaceutical knowledge than her claimed credentials would support. Her detailed explanations of metabolic pathways and toxicological mechanisms revealed professional-level expertise that contradicted her fabricated educational background. These knowledge discrepancies created additional pressure points that could be exploited through systematic questioning, designed to expose the gaps between her claimed identity and demonstrated capabilities. Each contradiction weakened her credibility, while providing evidence of deception that could support broader accusations about her criminal activities. The conversation dynamics required careful management to prevent Victoria from recognizing that she was providing incriminating information while maintaining the appearance of normal family discussion. My father's presence as an unwitting witness created additional complexity because his cognitive impairment from chronic poisoning limited his ability to understand the true nature of our conversation, while potentially providing corroborating testimony for any subsequent legal proceedings. As Victoria's anxiety increased in response to my systematic questioning, she began making subtle attempts to redirect attention away from her technical knowledge and toward other explanations for my father's health problems. Her suggestions included potential workplace chemical exposures, environmental toxins, and hereditary medical conditions that might account for his declining physical and cognitive function. These deflection attempts provided opportunities to introduce more direct questions about specific symptoms that aligned with known poisoning syndromes. When I mentioned that my father's symptom pattern resembled cases of chronic heavy metal exposure I had studied in my forensic chemistry coursework, Victoria's reaction confirmed that she understood the implications of such comparisons. Her immediate response involved detailed questions about my academic research and laboratory training that revealed her concern about my technical capabilities for detecting poisoning activities. The intensity of her interest in my forensic education provided clear evidence that she viewed my analytical skills as potential threats to her criminal operations. This recognition created opportunities to introduce information about my recent laboratory analysis of household environmental samples, presented as routine academic research rather than targeted investigation of poisoning activities. Victoria's reaction to learning about my toxicological testing capabilities provided the most dramatic evidence yet obtained regarding her criminal consciousness and awareness of potential exposure risks. When I mentioned that preliminary results from my environmental analysis had identified unexpected chemical compounds that warranted further investigation, Victoria's composure collapsed entirely. Her facial expression shifted from defensive anxiety to obvious panic as she processed the implications of scientific evidence that could directly link her to systematic poisoning activities. Her immediate questions about the specific nature of my laboratory findings and their potential health implications revealed intimate familiarity with toxicological detection methods that far exceeded any legitimate knowledge requirements for grief counseling activities. The technical sophistication of her inquiries about analytical procedures and detection limits provided irrefutable evidence of criminal expertise that supported all my previous suspicions about her true identity and intentions. The psychological pressure created by recognition that scientific evidence was being compiled against her criminal operation prompted increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the significance of my laboratory findings while gathering intelligence about the extent of my investigation. Her questions about laboratory timelines, result interpretation, and reporting procedures revealed systematic thinking about evidence management and potential damage control strategies. When I informed her that comprehensive results would be available within 24 hours and that I planned to share interesting findings with my academic advisor and potentially medical professionals treating my father, Victoria's reaction provided definitive proof of criminal consciousness. Her immediate attempts to discourage such discussions while offering alternative explanations for any unusual chemical detections demonstrated clear awareness that scientific analysis would expose her poisoning activities. The conversation had successfully established that Victoria possessed technical knowledge inconsistent with her claimed background, demonstrated familiarity with toxicological detection methods that indicated criminal experience, and exhibited behavioral responses to scientific evidence that revealed guilty consciousness about systematic poisoning activities. However, the success of this initial interrogation phase created immediate safety concerns as Victoria recognized that her criminal operation faced imminent exposure through scientific evidence that she could not discredit or explain through innocent alternative theories. Her growing desperation suggested potential escalation to more direct violent methods for eliminating the primary threat to her continued criminal success. The transition from evidence collection to personal protection required implementing safety protocols while maintaining pressure that would prompt additional admissions before she could develop effective counter-strategies. The systematic approach that had successfully exposed her criminal knowledge needed adaptation to manage increasing physical danger while preserving the documentary evidence necessary for subsequent prosecution efforts. The transformation from investigative questioning to survival tactics represented the most critical phase of the entire operation. Victoria's recognition that her 8-year criminal enterprise faced potential collapse through scientific evidence and systematic investigation created circumstances where her demonstrated willingness to commit murder would likely prompt immediate action to eliminate the primary obstacle to her continued freedom and accumulated wealth. The psychological pressure created by my systematic interrogation had pushed Victoria to the precipice of complete exposure, but the critical moment of documented confession required additional strategic elements that would ensure irrefutable evidence collection while maintaining personal safety. The most effective approach involved introducing an unexpected participant who could provide external validation of my accusations, while constraining Victoria's options for violent retaliation or evidence destruction. Dr. Margaret Steinberg, my faculty advisor at Northwestern University, had been monitoring my extended absence from regular research activities, with growing concern about my academic progress and personal well-being. Her expertise in forensic toxicology, combined with her familiarity with my investigative capabilities, made her uniquely qualified to recognize the significance of my recent laboratory findings and provide professional credibility for accusations that might otherwise appear to be family conflict rather than criminal investigation. The decision to involve Dr. Steinberg represented a calculated expansion of the confrontation dynamic that would transform private family accusations into professional scientific inquiry with potential legal implications. Her presence would provide witness verification of any admissions obtained from Victoria while offering immediate expert analysis of evidence that could support subsequent prosecution efforts. Earlier that afternoon, I had contacted Dr. Steinberg using carefully constructed explanations about environmental health concerns affecting my family that required urgent professional consultation. The request appeared legitimate within the context of my graduate research focus on toxicological analysis methods, while providing sufficient detail about unusual chemical detections to motivate her immediate involvement in what she understood to be potential poisoning investigation. Dr. Steinberg's arrival at our residence during dessert service created the dramatic shift in confrontation dynamics that would prove essential for obtaining documented admissions from Victoria. Her professional authority and obvious expertise in chemical analysis represented existential threats to Victoria's criminal operation that could not be managed through manipulation tactics that had been effective with family members or medical professionals lacking specialized knowledge. The introduction of Dr. Steinberg required careful management to prevent Victoria from recognizing the coordinated nature of her involvement while establishing the scientific framework necessary for systematic evidence presentation. The conversation needed to appear as spontaneous professional consultation rather than planned intervention, maintaining plausible circumstances while creating optimal conditions for exposing Victoria's criminal activities. Victoria's reaction to Dr. Steinberg's unexpected arrival provided immediate confirmation of her criminal consciousness, as she recognized the professional threat represented by someone with expertise in precisely the analytical methods that could expose systematic poisoning operations. Her facial expression shifted from defensive anxiety to barely concealed panic as she processed the implications of having a forensic toxicology expert present during what she had intended to be a private family dinner. Dr. Steinberg's professional demeanor and obvious competence created immediate credibility that contrasted sharply with Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior and contradictory explanations about her background and qualifications. The juxtaposition between legitimate expertise and fabricated credentials became immediately apparent to anyone observing their interaction, providing clear evidence of deception that supported broader accusations about Victoria's criminal identity. When Dr. Steinberg requested detailed information about my father's medical history and symptom progression for correlation with potential environmental exposure scenarios, Victoria's responses revealed knowledge gaps and inconsistencies that exposed her lack of legitimate medical training. Her attempts to provide technical explanations about complex physiological processes contained fundamental errors that demonstrated superficial understanding acquired through criminal research rather than professional education. The conversation dynamic shifted decisively in favor of systematic evidence collection as Dr. Steinberg's questions created professional pressure that Victoria could not deflect through emotional manipulation or relationship appeals. Her expertise in toxicological investigation provided frameworks for systematic inquiry that exposed criminal activities through scientific methodology, rather than personal accusations that might be dismissed as family conflict. Dr. Steinberg's review of the preliminary laboratory results I had obtained through my covert food sample analysis provided immediate professional validation of my poisoning suspicions, while establishing scientific credibility for accusations that Victoria had been systematically administering toxic substances to family members. Her expert interpretation of analytical data transformed theoretical possibilities into documented evidence of deliberate criminal activity. The professional consultation format created optimal conditions for obtaining recorded admissions, as Victoria's attempts to explain analytical findings forced her to demonstrate knowledge about toxic substances and their physiological effects that far exceeded her claimed credentials as a grief counselor. Each technical explanation provided additional evidence of criminal expertise, while documenting consciousness of guilt that would prove essential for subsequent prosecution efforts. When Dr. Steinberg questioned Victoria about her familiarity with specific chemical compounds identified in our laboratory analysis, her responses revealed intimate knowledge of toxicological mechanisms that could only be acquired through extensive criminal research or professional training that she had concealed from our family. The technical sophistication of her explanations contradicted every aspect of her fabricated identity, while providing irrefutable evidence of systematic poisoning activities. The psychological pressure created by professional scrutiny from someone with legitimate expertise in forensic investigation prompted increasingly desperate attempts from Victoria to maintain her cover story, while explaining away evidence that directly implicated her in systematic criminal activities. Her explanations became progressively more elaborate and contradictory, as she struggled to reconcile her demonstrated technical knowledge with her claimed background limitations. Dr. Steinberg's systematic questioning revealed that Victoria possessed detailed understanding of arsenic toxicity patterns, digitalis administration methods, and complex drug interaction scenarios that enabled sophisticated poisoning operations. This knowledge base required years of specialized study or extensive criminal experience that contradicted every element of her constructed grief counselor identity. The conversation reached its critical breakthrough when Dr. Steinberg directly confronted Victoria about the impossibility of explaining her demonstrated expertise through legitimate educational channels, forcing her to choose between admitting criminal knowledge or providing verifiable credentials that could be independently confirmed through professional licensing authorities. Victoria's response to this professional challenge provided the documented admission that transformed months of investigation into irrefutable evidence of systematic murder operations. Her confession revealed not only her involvement in poisoning my father and myself, but also provided details about her previous criminal activities that aligned perfectly with the background investigation I had conducted into her history of targeting wealthy widowed men. The admission included specific information about the toxic substances she had been administering, the dosing schedules designed to create gradual health deterioration, and the financial motivations underlying her systematic elimination of family members who represented obstacles to inheritance acquisition. Her detailed explanations demonstrated the professional planning and execution that had enabled successful murder operations across multiple states over nearly a decade. Dr. Steinberg's professional recording equipment captured every element of Victoria's confession while providing expert witness testimony that would prove essential for subsequent prosecution efforts. Her presence transformed what might have been dismissed as family accusations into documented scientific evidence supported by professional expertise that could withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and judicial review. The validation provided by Dr. Steinberg's involvement represented the culmination of weeks of systematic investigation and strategic planning that had successfully exposed a sophisticated criminal enterprise operating within our family structure. Her expertise and credibility provided the external verification necessary to transform private suspicions into actionable legal evidence that would ensure Victoria faced appropriate consequences for her crimes. However, the success of obtaining documented confessions created immediate safety concerns, as Victoria recognized that her criminal operation faced complete exposure through scientific evidence and professional testimony that she could not discredit or explain through alternative theories. Her desperation suggested potential escalation to immediate violence as her only remaining option for preventing prosecution and preserving her freedom. The transformation from evidence collection to survival situation required implementing emergency protocols while preserving the documentary evidence that would prove essential for ensuring justice for Victoria's multiple victims across her 8-year criminal career. The systematic approach that had successfully exposed her operations now needed adaptation to manage the immediate physical danger posed by someone whose accumulated wealth and freedom depended on eliminating the primary obstacles to her continued criminal success. The presence of Dr. Steinberg had fundamentally altered the confrontation dynamics, creating professional pressure that stripped away Victoria's ability to maintain her fabricated identity through emotional manipulation. The systematic questioning had successfully exposed her criminal knowledge and consciousness of guilt, but the critical moment required transforming these psychological advantages into documented admissions that would provide irrefutable evidence for prosecution purposes while ensuring immediate protection for potential future victims. Victoria's recognition that her 8-year criminal enterprise faced complete exposure through scientific evidence and professional testimony created a psychological crisis that manifested through increasingly erratic behavior and desperate attempts to regain control over circumstances that had evolved beyond her management capabilities. Her criminal expertise had prepared her for managing individual family members or medical professionals with limited forensic training, but confronting legitimate scientific investigation, supported by professional credentials, represented scenarios for which her experience provided no effective countermeasures. The transformation of our family dining room into a formal interrogation environment required careful orchestration to maintain legal admissibility standards while preventing Victoria from recognizing opportunities for escape or evidence destruction. Dr. Steinberg's professional recording equipment provided comprehensive documentation capabilities, but successful evidence collection required strategic questioning that would prompt specific admissions about criminal intent, methodological approaches, and victim targeting strategies. The initial phase of formal questioning focused on establishing Victoria's true identity and criminal background through systematic exploration of the contradictions between her claimed credentials and demonstrated expertise. Dr. Steinberg's professional authority created psychological pressure that prevented Victoria from deflecting inquiries through emotional appeals or relationship manipulation tactics that had been effective with family members lacking specialized knowledge. When confronted with specific questions about her educational background and professional licensing, Victoria's responses revealed the comprehensive nature of her identity fabrication while providing documented evidence of deliberate deception designed to facilitate criminal operations. Her inability to provide verifiable credentials or educational transcripts confirmed that her entire professional persona had been constructed specifically for targeting vulnerable wealthy individuals through fabricated therapeutic relationships. The questioning progression advanced to examine her technical knowledge of toxicological substances and administration methods that had enabled sophisticated poisoning operations across multiple jurisdictions. Victoria's detailed explanations of chemical properties, physiological effects, and dosing strategies demonstrated expertise that required extensive specialized training or criminal experience that contradicted every element of her claimed background. Dr. Steinberg's systematic approach to evidence extraction utilized professional interrogation techniques that maximized information collection while maintaining psychological pressure that prevented Victoria from developing effective defensive strategies. Each question built upon previous responses to create comprehensive documentation of criminal knowledge and intent that would prove essential for subsequent prosecution efforts. The critical breakthrough occurred when Victoria was directly confronted with laboratory evidence demonstrating the presence of multiple toxic substances in food samples collected from our family meals over the preceding weeks. Her response to this scientific documentation provided the definitive admission that transformed months of investigation into irrefutable proof of systematic murder attempts. Victoria's confession revealed the sophisticated planning and execution that had characterized her criminal operations, including detailed information about substance selection, dosing schedules, and victim monitoring procedures that demonstrated professional-level expertise in systematic poisoning. Her explanations provided comprehensive evidence of premeditation and criminal intent that would prove essential for establishing appropriate charges and sentence recommendations. The admission expanded to include specific details about her previous criminal activities involving the systematic murder of wealthy widowed men across multiple states over nearly a decade. Victoria's detailed descriptions of victim selection criteria, relationship development strategies, and murder methodologies revealed the scope of her criminal enterprise, while providing evidence that could support additional prosecution efforts for previously unrecognized murder cases. Her confession included financial information about inheritance proceeds and money laundering operations that had enabled her to accumulate substantial wealth through systematic criminal activities. The detailed accounting of stolen assets provided evidence for civil recovery efforts, while establishing the financial motivations underlying her systematic targeting of vulnerable, wealthy individuals. The psychological pressure created by professional confrontation and scientific evidence had prompted Victoria to provide comprehensive documentation of criminal activities that exceeded any reasonable expectations for evidence collection in domestic criminal investigation scenarios. Her detailed admissions created irrefutable proof of systematic murder operations while providing intelligence about criminal methodologies that could prevent future similar crimes. However, the success of obtaining comprehensive confessions created immediate safety concerns as Victoria recognized that her complete criminal exposure eliminated any possibility of maintaining her current identity or continuing her systematic operations. Her desperation suggested potential escalation to immediate violence as her only remaining option for preventing prosecution while attempting to eliminate witnesses who possessed detailed knowledge of her criminal enterprise. The transition from evidence collection to emergency response required implementing safety protocols while preserving the comprehensive documentation that had been obtained through systematic investigation and professional interrogation. Victoria's demonstrated willingness to commit murder, combined with her intimate knowledge of our household environment, created immediate threats that demanded tactical response rather than continued questioning. Dr. Steinberg's professional training included emergency response protocols for situations where criminal investigations created immediate danger to participants or witnesses. Her experience with law enforcement coordination provided essential capabilities for ensuring appropriate authorities received comprehensive evidence while implementing protective measures for individuals who had been targeted for elimination. The emergency communication systems that had been prepared during the strategic planning phase enabled immediate contact with federal law enforcement agencies that possessed jurisdiction and expertise for investigating complex financial crimes across state boundaries. The comprehensive evidence package that had been prepared for immediate transmission ensured that criminal investigation could continue regardless of what happened to individual participants during the immediate crisis situation. Victoria's reaction to recognizing that law enforcement notification was imminent provided final confirmation of her criminal consciousness while demonstrating the sophisticated planning she had developed for managing crisis situations. Her immediate attempts to implement what appeared to be predetermined emergency protocols suggested that she possessed contingency plans for situations where her criminal operations faced exposure. The systematic approach that had successfully exposed Victoria's criminal enterprise now required adaptation to manage immediate physical danger, while ensuring that comprehensive evidence reached appropriate authorities who could prevent her escape and protect potential future victims. The documentation obtained through months of investigation and strategic confrontation would prove essential for prosecution efforts, but immediate survival required different capabilities that prioritized tactical response over evidence collection. The transformation from investigative success to survival situation represented the most critical test of whether systematic preparation and professional collaboration could triumph over criminal expertise backed by substantial resources, and demonstrated willingness to eliminate obstacles through violent means. The stakes involved not only personal survival but ensuring that justice was achieved for Victoria's multiple victims, while preventing future criminal activities that could claim additional lives. The comprehensive confession that had been obtained through strategic investigation and professional interrogation provided irrefutable evidence of systematic criminal activities spanning nearly a decade of murder operations. However, the immediate challenge involved translating this investigative success into personal survival during the critical period, when Victoria's recognition of complete exposure would likely prompt desperate measures to preserve her freedom and accumulated wealth. The comprehensive confession obtained through systematic interrogation represented a transformational achievement that validated months of intensive investigation, while providing irrefutable evidence of Victoria's extensive criminal enterprise. Her detailed admissions had documented not only the systematic poisoning operations targeting my father and myself, but also revealed the broader scope of her serial killing activities across multiple states spanning nearly a decade of predatory criminal behavior. The immediate priority involved ensuring that this critical evidence reached appropriate law enforcement authorities while maintaining personal safety during the dangerous period when Victoria's recognition of complete exposure would likely prompt desperate countermeasures. Dr. Steinberg's professional protocols for evidence preservation and emergency communication provided essential capabilities for transforming investigative success into actionable prosecution materials while protecting witnesses from retaliation attempts. The federal law enforcement response to our emergency notification exceeded all expectations for investigative resource allocation and operational urgency. Special Agent Patricia Reynolds from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division had been contacted through Drive. Steinberg's established professional networks with law enforcement agencies that regularly utilized university forensic expertise for complex criminal investigations. Agent Reynolds' immediate recognition of the significance of our evidence stemmed from her extensive experience investigating sophisticated financial fraud operations that targeted vulnerable elderly individuals through systematic deception and exploitation schemes. Her expertise in multi-jurisdictional criminal enterprises provided essential perspective for understanding the scope and complexity of Victoria's operations, while ensuring appropriate coordination with state and local authorities in jurisdictions where previous murders had occurred. The rapid mobilization of federal investigative resources demonstrated the exceptional nature of our case and the comprehensive evidence that had been compiled through systematic investigation. Within 2 hours of initial contact, specialized teams had been deployed to secure our residence, initiate comprehensive background investigations of Victoria's multiple identities, and coordinate with medical examiners in jurisdictions where her previous victims had died under circumstances that could now be recognized as systematic murder. Agent Reynolds' review of our compiled evidence revealed investigative quality that exceeded typical standards for civilian criminal reporting, while providing comprehensive documentation that would prove essential for successful prosecution efforts. Her professional assessment confirmed that the toxicological analysis, financial investigation, background research, and recorded confession provided sufficient evidence to support federal charges including conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and multiple counts of first-degree murder. The validation provided by federal law enforcement recognition represented the culmination of a transformation process that had evolved from personal suspicion to professional-grade criminal investigation, capable of exposing sophisticated criminal enterprises operating across multiple jurisdictions. The systematic approach that had guided every phase of evidence collection had successfully overcome the challenges inherent in investigating experienced criminals who possessed extensive knowledge of forensic countermeasures and legal vulnerabilities. However, the immediate challenge involved managing Victoria's reaction to the arrival of federal agents, while ensuring that she could not implement escape protocols or evidence destruction procedures that might compromise prosecution efforts. Her criminal expertise included contingency planning for situations where operations faced law enforcement scrutiny, and her demonstrated willingness to commit murder suggested that witness elimination represented a viable tactical option for preserving her freedom and accumulated wealth. The federal response protocols implemented by Agent Reynolds included immediate protective custody arrangements for family members who had been targeted for elimination while establishing comprehensive surveillance operations designed to prevent Victoria from accessing weapons, communication systems, or transportation resources that could enable escape attempts or retaliation activities. The professional coordination between university forensic expertise and federal investigative capabilities created optimal conditions for evidence preservation while ensuring that all participants received appropriate protection during the critical period when Victoria's criminal operation faced complete exposure. Dr. Steinberg's role as expert witness provided scientific credibility for prosecution efforts, while her established professional relationships facilitated seamless collaboration with law enforcement agencies. Victoria's arrest occurred within 4 hours of Agent Reynolds' initial arrival at our residence, following comprehensive coordination with tactical teams that had been positioned to prevent escape attempts, while ensuring the safety of all participants. Her behavior during the arrest process provided additional evidence of criminal consciousness as she immediately requested legal representation while refusing to provide any statements about her activities or background. The search warrant execution at our residence yielded extensive physical evidence that corroborated every element of the confession that had been obtained through systematic interrogation. Hidden supplies of toxic substances, detailed victim files, and financial records documenting money laundering operations provided comprehensive confirmation of the systematic criminal enterprise that had been exposed through our investigation. The discovery of detailed planning documents revealed the sophisticated nature of Victoria's operations while providing evidence of additional potential victims who had been targeted for future criminal activities. Her victim selection criteria, relationship development strategies, and operational security measures demonstrated professional-level criminal planning that had enabled successful operations across multiple states without detection by law enforcement authorities. Federal coordination with state authorities in jurisdictions where Victoria's previous victims had died resulted in immediate reopening of cases that had been previously classified as natural deaths or medical emergencies. The comprehensive evidence provided by our investigation enabled forensic re-examination of circumstances that could now be recognized as systematic murder operations disguised through sophisticated toxicological methods. The broader implications of our successful investigation extended beyond individual justice considerations to include systemic improvements in detection capabilities for similar criminal operations that might be targeting vulnerable populations across the country. The methodologies that had been developed through our civilian investigation provided templates for professional law enforcement approaches to complex financial fraud schemes involving systematic exploitation of elderly individuals. Recognition from federal authorities that our investigation had achieved results that exceeded typical professional standards provided profound validation of the systematic approach that had guided every phase of evidence collection and analysis. The transformation from graduate student to effective criminal investigator demonstrated the potential for individual initiative to achieve extraordinary results when supported by comprehensive preparation and professional collaboration. Agent Reynolds' assessment that our evidence compilation represented one of the most thorough civilian investigations she had encountered in 20 years of federal law enforcement provided professional recognition that validated the intensive effort and systematic methodology that had been applied to exposing Victoria's criminal enterprise. Her recommendation that our investigative approach be documented for training purposes acknowledged the broader value of our systematic methods for addressing similar criminal challenges. The immediate success of achieving Victoria's arrest and comprehensive evidence preservation created opportunities for expanding the investigation to address additional aspects of her criminal operations that might yield evidence of other victims or collaborators who had participated in her systematic murder schemes. The financial records that had been obtained through search warrant execution revealed complex networks of professional relationships that suggested broader criminal organizations might have supported her operations. Federal asset forfeiture proceedings initiated against Victoria's accumulated wealth provided mechanisms for recovering stolen inheritance proceeds, while ensuring that financial resources could not be utilized for legal defense efforts that might compromise prosecution success. The comprehensive documentation of money laundering operations enabled efficient identification and seizure of assets that had been acquired through systematic criminal activities. The transformation of our family crisis into successful federal criminal investigation represented a profound achievement that demonstrated the potential for individual initiative and systematic investigation to overcome sophisticated criminal operations that had previously evaded detection by professional law enforcement agencies. The validation provided by federal recognition confirmed that comprehensive preparation and strategic thinking could achieve extraordinary results, even when confronting experienced criminals with substantial resources and expertise. However, the success of achieving immediate arrest and evidence preservation created new responsibilities for supporting ongoing prosecution efforts, while managing the psychological aftermath of discovering that trusted family members had been targeted for systematic murder by someone who had been welcomed into our household as a caring stepmother and devoted spouse. The successful arrest of Victoria and the comprehensive evidence preservation that had been achieved through systematic investigation created an entirely new set of complex challenges that required transitioning from criminal detection to supporting federal prosecution efforts, while managing the profound psychological and practical implications of discovering systematic murder operations within our family structure. The validation provided by law enforcement recognition represented a significant achievement, but the subsequent legal proceedings and victim recovery processes demanded sustained commitment to objectives that extended far beyond personal survival considerations. The federal prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Martinez, required extensive cooperation with witness preparation activities that would ensure successful presentation of evidence during complex legal proceedings involving multiple jurisdictions and sophisticated criminal defense strategies. Victoria's accumulated wealth from previous murder operations enabled retention of experienced criminal defense attorneys who possessed expertise in challenging forensic evidence and witness testimony through aggressive legal tactics designed to create reasonable doubt about systematic criminal intent. The complexity of presenting toxicological evidence to juries lacking specialized scientific background required developing comprehensive educational presentations that would enable non-experts to understand the sophisticated poisoning methodologies that had been employed across Victoria's criminal operations. My role as expert witness demanded mastering communication techniques that could translate complex analytical procedures into clear explanations that would support prosecution arguments while withstanding cross-examination challenges from defense experts. The preparation process for expert witness testimony required intensive collaboration with prosecution attorneys who possessed extensive experience in presenting scientific evidence during high-profile criminal trials. Assistant United States Attorney Martinez had successfully prosecuted numerous complex financial fraud cases, but acknowledged that the combination of serial murder and sophisticated chemical analysis presented unique challenges that required unprecedented coordination between legal and scientific expertise. The witness preparation activities revealed the comprehensive scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise, while highlighting additional investigative requirements that had emerged from examination of evidence obtained through search warrant execution. Financial records had identified previously unknown bank accounts and investment portfolios that suggested her criminal operations extended beyond the documented murder cases to include additional fraud schemes targeting vulnerable elderly individuals across multiple states. The discovery of detailed victim assessment files revealed that Victoria had been systematically researching potential targets through comprehensive background investigations that identified wealthy widowed individuals with limited family connections and substantial liquid assets. These files contained personal information, financial analysis, and operational planning documents that demonstrated the professional level of preparation that had characterized her criminal activities. Federal coordination with state authorities in jurisdictions where Victoria's previous victims had died resulted in comprehensive exhumation orders and forensic re-examination of remains that had been buried following death determinations that could now be recognized as systematic murder cases. The toxicological analysis of preserved tissue samples required sophisticated analytical procedures that exceeded typical forensic laboratory capabilities, while demanding coordination with specialized research institutions that possessed requisite equipment and expertise. The expanded investigation had identified at least 8 additional potential victims, whose deaths had occurred under circumstances that aligned with Victoria's established operational patterns. These cases spanned 12 years of criminal activity and involved estimated theft totaling over $60 million through systematic inheritance fraud that had been concealed through sophisticated money laundering operations involving offshore banking and corporate structure manipulation. The magnitude of the criminal enterprise that had been exposed through our investigation created substantial media attention that complicated witness protection considerations while generating public interest in forensic detection methods that could prevent similar criminal operations. News coverage of the case highlighted the innovative civilian investigation techniques that had successfully exposed sophisticated criminal activities that had evaded detection by professional law enforcement agencies for over a decade. The psychological challenges associated with processing the discovery that our family had been systematically targeted for murder by someone who had been trusted as a caring stepmother and devoted spouse required professional counseling support while managing ongoing legal responsibilities that demanded sustained emotional stability during extended prosecution proceedings. The cognitive dissonance created by recognizing that intimate family relationships had been entirely fabricated for criminal purposes challenged fundamental assumptions about personal safety and institutional protection. My father's recovery from chronic poisoning effects required comprehensive medical treatment that addressed both physical damage from prolonged toxin exposure and psychological trauma associated with discovering that his wife had been systematically attempting to murder him for financial gain. The chelation therapy and supportive medical interventions had successfully reversed most physiological damage, but cognitive function recovery required extended rehabilitation that would continue throughout the prosecution timeline. The financial implications of Victoria's criminal operations included complex asset recovery proceedings that required determining legitimate ownership of property and investments that had been acquired through systematic theft from murder victims across multiple jurisdictions. Federal asset forfeiture procedures provided mechanisms for recovering stolen inheritance proceeds, but the legal complexity of distinguishing between legitimate acquisitions and criminal proceeds required extensive forensic accounting that would continue for months beyond the initial investigation. The educational opportunities created by the successful investigation included invitations to present findings at academic conferences focused on forensic science advancement and criminal justice innovation. The systematic methodology that had been developed through civilian investigation provided valuable insights for professional law enforcement training while demonstrating the potential for interdisciplinary collaboration between academic research and practical criminal detection efforts. Professional recognition from the forensic science community acknowledged that the investigative approach had achieved results that exceeded typical standards for criminal evidence compilation, while establishing new benchmarks for civilian participation in complex criminal investigations. The comprehensive documentation and systematic analysis had created case study materials that would prove valuable for training future forensic investigators and legal professionals. The broader implications of the successful investigation extended to policy considerations regarding improved detection capabilities for financial fraud schemes targeting vulnerable elderly populations. The methodologies that had been employed during the civilian investigation provided templates for enhancing professional law enforcement approaches to systematic criminal operations that exploit institutional limitations and regulatory gaps. Federal legislation introduced in response to the case included provisions for enhanced coordination between financial institutions, healthcare providers, and law enforcement agencies to improve detection of systematic exploitation schemes targeting elderly individuals through fabricated therapeutic relationships. The regulatory frameworks being developed would create reporting requirements and investigative protocols designed to prevent similar criminal operations from achieving the extended success that had characterized Victoria's activities. The transformation from graduate student to recognized expert in criminal investigation had created career opportunities that aligned professional development with personal values regarding justice and protection of vulnerable populations. The expertise that had been developed through necessity during the investigation process provided foundation for contributing to forensic science advancement while supporting ongoing efforts to improve criminal detection capabilities. However, the sustained commitment required for supporting prosecution efforts while managing ongoing media attention and professional recognition created new pressures that demanded balancing public responsibilities with personal recovery needs. The psychological resilience that had enabled successful investigation during crisis circumstances required adaptation to manage extended legal proceedings and continued exposure to details about systematic murder operations. The success of achieving Victoria's arrest and comprehensive evidence preservation had created opportunities for preventing future criminal activities while ensuring justice for multiple victims across her extended criminal career. The systematic approach that had guided the investigation continued to provide framework for supporting prosecution efforts while managing the complex implications of exposing sophisticated criminal enterprises that had previously operated without detection by professional authorities. The successful prosecution of Victoria's criminal enterprise had established comprehensive precedents for addressing sophisticated financial fraud operations, targeting vulnerable populations, while simultaneously creating opportunities for systemic improvements in detection capabilities that would benefit potential victims across multiple jurisdictions. The transformation from personal survival investigation to professional criminal justice contribution represented an evolution of purpose that aligned individual achievement with broader societal protection objectives through systematic institutional reform. The federal conviction had resulted in multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring that Victoria would never again threaten innocent families while providing closure for the documented victims whose deaths had been properly classified as systematic murder rather than natural causes. The comprehensive restitution proceedings had successfully recovered approximately $47 million in stolen inheritance proceeds, enabling financial compensation for surviving family members while demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated asset forfeiture operations. However, the most significant achievement involved the institutional changes that had been implemented in response to investigative findings that revealed systematic vulnerabilities in existing detection frameworks. Federal agencies had adopted enhanced screening protocols for suspicious death investigations involving recently remarried elderly individuals, while state authorities had implemented mandatory toxicological analysis requirements for cases involving unexplained health deterioration in wealthy widowed persons who had established new romantic relationships within 12 months of spousal death. The academic recognition received through presentation of investigative methodologies at national forensic science conferences had generated collaborative research opportunities, with leading institutions focused on developing technological solutions for early detection of systematic poisoning operations. The comprehensive documentation that had been compiled during the civilian investigation provided valuable case study materials for advancing forensic education, while establishing new benchmarks for evidence quality in complex criminal proceedings. Professional consultation requests from law enforcement agencies investigating similar cases had created opportunities for applying specialized expertise to active criminal investigations, while contributing to successful resolution of cases that might otherwise have remained unsolved. The analytical frameworks that had been developed through systematic investigation provided templates for addressing complex financial fraud schemes involving identity fabrication and long-term victim cultivation strategies. The establishment of the Victoria Blackwood Prevention Initiative represented a collaborative effort between academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, and victim advocacy organizations to develop comprehensive educational programs designed to protect vulnerable elderly populations from systematic exploitation through fabricated therapeutic relationships. The initiative provided funding for research into detection technologies while supporting educational outreach that would enable potential targets to recognize manipulation tactics before becoming victims. Legislative testimony provided to congressional committees considering enhanced protections for elderly individuals had incorporated specific recommendations based on investigative findings that revealed regulatory gaps enabling sophisticated criminal operations to operate without detection. The proposed legislation included provisions for mandatory background verification requirements for individuals providing therapeutic services to recently bereaved clients, while establishing reporting protocols for financial institutions that detected unusual asset transfer patterns involving elderly customers. The development of standardized training curricula for grief counseling professionals included comprehensive sections on ethical boundaries and reporting requirements designed to prevent criminal exploitation of therapeutic relationships. Professional licensing authorities had implemented enhanced background investigation procedures while establishing ongoing monitoring systems that would detect practitioners who might be utilizing fabricated credentials for criminal purposes. International collaboration with law enforcement agencies in countries where Victoria had maintained financial accounts had resulted in comprehensive treaty modifications that enhanced information sharing capabilities for investigating cross-border financial fraud operations. The sophisticated money laundering techniques that had been documented through the investigation provided valuable intelligence for addressing similar criminal enterprises operating in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The technological innovations developed through collaborative research efforts included advanced analytical software capable of identifying suspicious patterns in financial transactions that might indicate systematic inheritance fraud operations. These detection systems incorporated machine learning algorithms that could recognize victim targeting behaviors while alerting appropriate authorities to potential criminal activities before murder operations could be completed successfully. Medical professional education programs had been enhanced to include comprehensive training in recognizing poisoning symptoms that might be attributed to natural illness progression in elderly patients. Emergency room protocols now included mandatory toxicological screening procedures for suspicious cases involving elderly individuals who presented with unexplained symptom combinations that could indicate systematic chemical exposure. The establishment of specialized federal task forces dedicated to investigating sophisticated financial fraud operations targeting elderly populations provided institutional frameworks for coordinated response to criminal enterprises that operated across state boundaries. These task forces incorporated interdisciplinary expertise including forensic accounting, toxicological analysis, and psychological profiling capabilities that enabled comprehensive investigation of complex criminal operations. Private sector partnerships with financial institutions had resulted in implementation of enhanced monitoring systems that could detect unusual asset transfer patterns involving elderly customers who had recently experienced spousal death or established new romantic relationships. These detection systems provided early warning capabilities that could prevent successful completion of systematic inheritance fraud operations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.